What is up, guys? Rick Hackus here, and today we're talking about SMGs in the Division and whether or not they're overpowered. Now, this is one of the most common statements I see regarding the Division. So many people claim that SMGs or certain SMGs are overpowered, and that's why we're discussing it in today's video. However, this is a very important issue with a lot of gray area. It's also a complicated issue. At the end of the video, there won't be a definitive answer saying that, yes, SMGs are totally overpowered and they deserve a nerf, or no, everything's fine, leave the game alone. And unfortunately, people have already made comments saying that, of course SMGs are overpowered, ya dummy, and no, SMGs aren't overpowered, ya dummy. Unfortunately, jumping to these conclusions is ignoring very important elements of discussion along the way and doing the game we all enjoy a disservice. Now, one of the most interesting aspects around this argument that SMGs are overpowered is involving the rise and fall of the Vector 45 ACP. That gun saw its usage absolutely spike when the game was first initially released and people started to reach rank 30, and now has gone down substantially. And the reason being was simply because it was available in blueprint form as the high-end Vector 45 ACP from the special gear vendor located right in your base of operations. This was a very, very good gun that was very, very easy to get. Now, because this gun's usage absolutely flew up, like once everyone reached rank 30, basically the number one thing to do for most people was to simply buy the high-end Vector 45 ACP blueprint. And many people did, and when the game was about a week old, you could not go into the Dark Zone without seeing almost everyone using the Vector 45 ACP. Its usage was absolutely phenomenal, and that led a lot of people to say, look, SMGs are clearly overpowered, and if not SMGs, then the Vector 45 ACP is clearly overpowered. However, this argument began to falter once the game simply grew older and people started to get higher and higher in rankings, especially the Dark Zone rank, which allowed them to buy blueprints for both a high-end AUG and a high-end MP5. And now it's kind of a three-way split between the Vector, the AUG, and the MP5 kind of all competing for the best SMG, and people have their legitimate opinions over which one is better. Frankly, whatever one you get as the best role is probably going to be the one that you're going to be rocking. So this argument shows that anecdotal evidence is not always useful. Everyone saw everyone using Vector 45 ACPs for such a long time that many people claimed the Vector was just overpowered, when in reality it was a very good gun that was very easy to get. However, we then shift the focus off of the Vector and onto SMGs, because the Vector was readily available from the special gear vendor. But so was the Liberator, so was a classic AK-47. In fact, there was a lot of different gun types that were available to buy from that special gear vendor, so why did everyone buy the Vector? This does lend a lot more credence to the argument that SMGs as a gun type are generally better than their competition in assault rifles and light machine guns. Now, why are SMGs generally considered better than their competition? Well, let's compare them. SMGs versus assault rifles, and here in the gun range, we're going to go over their differences in terms of advantages and disadvantages when compared to each other. When you have an SMG, an advantage is that they're generally easier to use in terms of recoil. They're just point and shoot, and you don't really need any attachments that will calm down any sort of stability or accuracy factors of these guns. Now, that's opposed to assault rifles that, although some can spawn in that are quite accurate, in general they will recoil just a little bit more and generally do require some attachments enabling them to control that recoil, especially when we then shift over to an advantage for the assault rifles. They work at longer ranges. The damage carries from assault rifles a lot longer than it does for SMGs. When shooting targets at longer ranges with assault rifles, you're going to be doing more damage than with SMGs. That's a huge advantage for the assault rifles. However, the next advantage again lies with the SMG, and it's simply in terms of damage dealt. The damage that you're doing with SMGs is simply going to be higher in most cases than assault rifles. The pure damage is just as high. The rate of fires are often just as high. The advantage goes to SMGs because they have natively an additional factor, with critical hit chance increased up to the 20th percentile. We don't have to delve into the pure mathematical calculations of this, although you can search the internet. There's a million different examples that mathematically prove that SMGs just do more damage than assault rifles, but it's just common sense. If you have an assault rifle that's doing around 8,000 damage, shooting around 750 rounds per minute, and then you have basically the same thing in an SMG version, but the SMG does 20% more critical hit chance, the advantage is just going to lie in terms of damage dealt over close range with the SMG. Now, unfortunately, this problem is a little bit compounded by the fact that, we talked about the advantage of assault rifles is that they function out to longer ranges, although to do that, they may need some help from attachments in order to control that recoil. That's again going to help the SMGs do more damage, because with those attachments, let's say with a barrel attachment, with the SMGs, you can use barrel attachments that come with damage increasing factors, like critical hit chance or critical hit damage increase. Whereas for assault rifles, you're generally looking for increases to stability. So because you don't need any sort of attachments in order to increase the handling of most SMGs, you can focus it even more so on damage output. Advantage, SMG. However, this discrepancy, although it is present, isn't as wide as you might think, because you can find very, very good assault rifles that do combat SMGs. In fact, I've heard that, a tactical ACR, if you get a really good roll on a tactical ACR, for example, it's absolutely amazing and really rivals those top tier SMGs. However, when we're talking about an average SMG with average attachments versus an average assault rifle with average attachments, the SMG is usually going to win out in terms of handling, in terms of damage output, pretty much every time. But again, the discrepancy isn't massive. Where the discrepancy is massive is when you have SMGs versus light machine guns. Now look, I have a soft spot in my heart for light machine guns. I found a couple of really good light machine guns. I have an RPK-74 that just had the God roll, it had increased accuracy, and it had the brutal perk, so I did more headshot damage, and that thing was amazing. I use that gun so much, and I still use it sometimes, especially in the dark zone, because it can handle itself still versus NPCs. Then I can switch to my SMG for PvP encounters. However, looking at it mathematically and logically, SMGs are generally going to be just better than LMGs. Now, we could break down the elements where SMGs win and LMGs win just like we did with assault rifles, but basically it's going to be the same thing. SMGs generally have better handling or a little bit easier to use and do more damage, but LMGs function better at longer ranges, and they really do. There was times using that RPK-74 of mine that I was shooting it at enemies very far away at incredibly long ranges, extremely consistency, and at those scenarios, no SMG is going to be able to function as well. That LMG in that scenario is better than any SMG. The problem is simply this: that scenario really doesn't exist that often. The problem with LMGs in the division right now, and this problem is also kind of indicative of assault rifles as well, is that these guns are very consistent, and they could put a lot of damage on a target relatively accurately at relatively long range. They just take a while to kill that target, and that's the problem. When you're doing high-level content, challenging mode, or if you're doing the incursion, you do not have the time to stick your head out and shoot an enemy for a long period of time with consistent damage with an LMG. The reason being is because enemies melt you so fast when you're doing those high-level activities. You simply cannot fight the snipers in the incursion with an LMG, because one shot from them will lower your health basically to the very bottom, will almost one shot kill you. And because of that, you need to do your damage as quickly as possible. And that's why in any scenario where an LMG would be good, probably a marksman's rifle would be simply better. It can get a lot more damage a lot quicker onto target, and then you get to go back into cover. And that is really why you've seen SMG and also marksman's rifle usage absolutely spike, because you need to vomit out your damage as quickly as possible and then duck behind cover, because every enemy does so much damage when you're doing those high level activities. The consistent damaging weapons, which do have legitimate advantages over SMGs, for example, they just don't have a place in the endgame. Additionally, the amount of damage you're doing with SMGs is generally just a lot higher, especially when compared to LMGs. I saw a mathematical calculation where it was a Vector 45 ACP versus an M249B, and in like 2.7 seconds, the Vector 45 did as much critical damage as it took the LMG to do it in 27 seconds. So that shows you just how massively ahead the SMGs are in just spewing out their damage. Now again, this is only going to be in close range. At long range, LMGs are probably better, but again, you don't have the opportunity to have continued long range gunfights when you're doing high level activities because you're melted so fast by enemies. So, my conclusion to this argument whether or not SMGs is overpowered is a very interesting one. In some aspects, they aren't necessarily overpowered because statistically, the other guns do have an advantage. You know, the assault rifles and LMGs are a lot more functionable at longer ranges. And yet, on the other hand, SMGs are clearly a little overpowered simply in the fact that they are the best choice when doing endgame activities over most other gun types. This isn't even necessarily the fault of the gun, but rather indicative of the playstyle that is required for these endgame activities. And that whole spiel about vomiting out damage as quickly as possible also totally applies to the Dark Zone. In the Dark Zone, since you don't actually go rogue until you actually start shooting, the most effective strategy is to walk right up to someone and just plug them in the face. So, what's the solution to this? Well, firstly, I think that SMGs, as they are right now, are a little ridiculous. Just go into the Dark Zone, get melted in a fraction of a second, and you'll see why. I think that you could have a little bit of a nerf to SMGs that would make most people happy and really bring them down to earth. And that nerf is simply to just lower the percent chance of the increased critical hit chance. So instead of being up to the 20-25 percentile, lower that down to 15%. That's still going to make a really good gun. Natively, 15% more critical damage is already insane. We have 70 different attachments and perks and all that stuff that increase it even more. But again, it's just going to kind of bring them down to earth while still maintaining them to be very powerful. Now, assault rifles really aren't in that bad of a place right now. I would recommend increasing their base damage, just kind of rewarding you from actually landing your shots accurately at range, and I would love to see kind of a special stat increased, just like how critical hit chances increase on SMGs and headshot damages increase on marksman's rifles. Something should be increased on assault rifles and LMGs as well. For assault rifles, maybe it's range, maybe actually a bonus to body shot damage, just non-headshot damage, and that's really going to make assault rifles more consistent in their damage output, a factor that they already kind of have. Now for LMGs, there's really no other way to put this, but you need to massively increase their base damage. I'm not talking by a couple thousand, I'm talking by like 10,000. The LMGs, especially the really slow shooting ones, like the M249B, like the M60, those need to be doing like 15,000 damage per shot. That's the only way that they're going to be worth using, because you have to go through so much trouble to even just get them accurate. You have to go out of cover and shoot them, and then place that reticle over the enemy's head after you've already been shooting for a while to get it accurate, just to then start getting some consistent damage on an enemy. They need to be doing substantial damage in order to reward you with doing this, especially if you're not going to increase their critical hit chance. And shotguns need a little bit of a buff as well. We haven't really talked about them in this video, but they simply aren't being used because there's a massive risk-reward element when using a shotgun. You have to get right into the enemy's face, and we've already discussed that enemies melt you so fast, and then you need to be doing massive damage to that enemy. Unfortunately, shotguns right now lack the massive damage part. When it takes like an entire magazine from a shotgun to kill an enemy, that's just not going to cut it. You need to massively increase shotgun damage. However, that does spell a little bit of trouble for the Dark Zone if you're able to go up and one-shot enemies in the Dark Zone, because again, you don't go rogue until the moment you shoot. That is a problem. You might actually have to make shotguns weaker just for the Dark Zone in order to increase their PvE usage, because otherwise I don't really see a way around it. Shotguns are going to remain pretty underused. Now that's essentially it for the video, guys. My ultimate goal here is balance. I want every gun to be usable, and right now I think it's pretty clear that they just aren't. No one is using an M249B and an M60, a lot of assault rifles in the incursions. All you pretty much see are SMGs and marksman's rifles, and there's a reason for that. Statistically, they're just better. However, it's not all about mathematics and statistics when it comes to making this argument, but that's the route that most people make. The point of this video was to make the argument that there's actual gameplay elements that lend themselves to making SMGs arguably overpowered. That the way you play the game, especially for the endgame content, especially in the dark zone, requires you to vomit out damage as quickly as possible. That lends themselves again to SMGs and keeps consistent damaging gun types like LMGs and assault rifles in the dark. There needs to be some substantial rebalances in order to make some of these other gun types usable. Now that's it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Now if you did, and if you agree with what I'm saying in this video, please remember to help rate and share it so the developers will hopefully see it. Now if you want to see more Division content, don't be afraid to slap that subscribe button. If you want to get in touch with me and keep up to date with the latest channel activity, the best way is to follow me on Twitter. That's linked in the description down below, as is my Twitch channel, which you can also follow. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good day.